Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. Food within religion is an ongoing discussion I've been having on this show for a while. My conversations about food, notably my conversation on foodways with Dr. Nora Rubel and Dr. Ben Zeller, and my conversation on the ethics of being Buddhist and a chef with Chef Eric Repair, are among my most highly downloaded episodes ever. And that is not surprising to me at all. Food connects and binds human beings together. This episode is about food and focuses on the question, should all Buddhists be vegetarians? Which is a commonly asked question within Buddhist circles today. My guest on this episode is Dr. Geoffrey Barstow, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Oregon State University. His research focuses on the history and theory of vegetarianism in Tibet. He is the editor and contributor to the new book, The Faults of Meat, Tibetan Buddhist Writings on Vegetarianism, out now from Wisdom Publications. He is also the author of the academic monograph, Food of Sinful Demons, Meat, Vegetarianism, and the Limits of Buddhism in Tibet, out in 2018 from Columbia University Press. In this episode, we discuss the history of Buddhist writings related to vegetarianism, the Buddha's stance on vegetarianism, the work of translating centuries-old texts, and trends within Buddhist vegetarianism over the centuries. You can follow Dr. Barstow on Twitter and Instagram under the handle @TheLostYak. You can find me on Twitter at classical_ideas or at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Without further delay, please enjoy my conversation on Tibetan Buddhist vegetarianism and the book The Faults of Meat with Dr. Geoffrey Barstow. Dr. Geoffrey Barstow, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. Can you just spend a moment and introduce yourself however you see fit?
Yeah, I am. So I'm an assistant professor of religious studies out here in Oregon at Oregon State University. And my research for really the last 10 years has been focused on the history and practice of vegetarianism among Tibetan Buddhists. And so that started out as my dissertation. That led into my first book, monograph, and then also to the book that we're going to be talking about today. So that's really what I do. And it's always fun to get to talk about this stuff. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
What is the name of your first book and who put it out, if I may ask?
The first book is called Food of Sinful Demons, and it was published by Columbia University Press.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So if anybody likes what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I was just going to say that came out at the very end of 2017, but it has a date of 2018 on it.
Fantastic. So I want to travel a little back in time. What is the story behind why you're interested in Tibetan Buddhism so much so that you made it a career? Like, who inspired you to be involved in this area of study?
You know, honestly, so many people, I don't even know where to start. I was interested in religion, both from, I would say, sort of a curiosity standpoint and also a practitioner standpoint from, honestly, since high school. And so when I went to college, I was really fortunate and had a couple of really powerful opportunities open up. I was able to do some travel, some study abroad while I was in college. And and really ended up connecting with members of the Tibetan community, members of the Tibetan Buddhist community. And it was, for me, the perfect blend of really interesting and also really profound, and a lot of stuff that really made me think about myself, my life, what I did. And yeah, so as soon as I graduated from college, I went and I moved to Nepal and studied at the Rongchen Yeshe Institute for 4 years, from 2012 to or 2002 to 2006, and yeah, it's kind of all downhill from there.
Where did you first encounter Tibetan Buddhism? Was it when you were in high school, or like how did you? When is your earliest memory of realizing you were talking about Tibetan Buddhism?
It was actually the earliest time I actually encountered it was on a study abroad program in college. And I had not had any exposure to it in high school. Certainly not anything, significant beyond like, oh, maybe I heard the Dalai Lama's name at some point or something like that. But then where I went to college, at a school in Massachusetts called Hampshire College, they had a 1 month January study abroad program at the Tibetan University in Sarnath in India. And at the time, I was really interested in studying Taoism. But given that interest, this was something that I just jumped at this opportunity. And yeah, it was obviously pretty transformational. I really haven't looked back since then. And that was way back in January of 1999,
So,
20 years.
so studying this for so long, did you have any chance to do any Tibetan language study or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I started studying Tibetan. I did a semester of it as an undergrad while on the Antioch program in Bodh Gaya, India. But really, I did most of my Tibetan while I was at the Rongchen Yeshe Institute in Kathmandu. And so that my studies there really put me on, gave me a real leg up on sort of the academic track once I came back to the US. Because when I went into the master's program, I had already done most of my language training and was really able to focus on content. And that has been a real, just a real benefit and blessing ever since.
What do you think are what were some of the most difficult parts of like the learning process behind studying Tibetan? Because it seems like a language that would be extremely difficult for Westerners to study.
It's yes and no. I think it's a complicated language. It's totally unfamiliar to most of us, but it's also alphabetic. And so I had come to, before studying Tibetan, I had studied Chinese for a while, and so then coming from sort of studying Chinese, I just remember being like, wait, there's an alphabet I can learn. This is wonderful. And so that was really great. So I think it's a mixed thing. I mean, it's definitely not easy, but it's not incredibly difficult either. And I would definitely encourage people who are interested to study it. There are all kinds of wonderful resources these days. You can take online classes. There are multiple universities that teach Tibetan. And particularly for sort of philosophically inclined people like the listeners of your podcast, the philosophical literature in Tibetan is just so rich and so varied and so interesting that and still largely untranslated. So I would encourage people to go and take that leap.
Very cool. Well, so we're going to talk about your new book, which of which you are the editor and also a contributor, and the book is called The Faults of Meats: Tibetan Buddhist Writings and Vegetarianism, which is out now from Wisdom Publications. How did you get hooked up with Wisdom Publications for this book as opposed to like an academic press?
It was really important to me that this come out with a popular press. My first book, Food of Sinful Demons, is an academic monograph, right? It's really, the target audience is academics. I tried to write in a way, of course, that would be open to other people, and I've had positive interactions around it with people who are not academics. But really, it's an academic book. But I also wanted to do something that would really open up this whole question and the resources surrounding this question to the practitioner, sort of the broader community, particularly including Buddhist practitioners, but also just sort of people out there in the world who are wondering about or who are sort of dealing with the question of vegetarianism. And in part, that's because I think that the Tibetan voices that show up in this book really have something to say and are saying something that's sort of similar but different, that dovetails with what a lot of contemporary people who are writing about vegetarianism think, but also have some unique perspectives on it. And I wanted to be able to try to bring those perspectives and make them available in a way that lots of different people could use.
Awesome. Well, I love Wisdom Publications. I've featured many of their authors on this show, and it's really a pleasure to add you to the roster of wisdom folks who've been on here. So you write in your conventions chapter at the very beginning of the book about translation and about how the translation is rendered into English as the faults of meats. And that got me thinking about what the title of this book even means. Can you tell me a little about what the title means?
Yeah, the title is, as you're saying, a direct translation of a Tibetan term. The term in Tibetan is Shai Nyemik, and really it means the faults of meat. It's actually a genre of literature, and so it's part of a broader genre, what we would call the Nyemik or the faults genre. So we also have texts like Changi Nyemik, which would be like the faults of alcohol. Tamagi Nyemik, the faults of tobacco. And basically what texts in this genre do is talk about why you should not engage or why you should not partake of these substances or whatever the subject of the text is. And so actually lots of the texts that are featured in this book have the faults of meat somewhere in their Tibetan title. It happens often enough that sometimes I have to come up with something else, some other thing to call it, so that all of the books or all of the texts in the table of contents don't just say the faults of meat by so and so, and the faults of meat by someone else, and the faults of meat by this other person. So it felt like just sort of a natural title for this book because it does show up so much in the literature itself.
Awesome. Okay, well, that's really interesting that it's a genre of literature. And so that kind of leads into a question that I'm also wondering is what sort of works did you compile within the book? Like what eras are we talking about?
Yeah.
Tell me about like the range and scope of the pieces that are within this text.
Yeah, so my overarching goal with this was really to try to present as comprehensive a picture of Tibetan writings on meat eating as I could. And so there are a lot of other texts that didn't get included, right? This is it's not exhaustive by any measure, and I can think of a few, really interesting ones that didn't make the cut. But really, what I was trying to do was go for breadth as well as depth, and so I wanted to get texts that had a sustained engagement with meat, that were more than just a few lines or a few paragraphs in a text on a different topic, but also that presented as many different kinds of arguments and as many different perspectives as possible. So the book actually, if you don't mind me taking a moment to just sort of talk about the contents.
Yeah, of course.
The first chapter is actually not Tibetan material. It's canonical text. It presents translations of 2 Indian sutras. So 2 texts which were presented as the word of the Buddha. And I include these primarily because both of them are cited throughout the rest of the other texts in the volume. So those are sort of in there as background. But then after that, we start with texts. I think the next text in here is Dolpopa. So we're going, quite far back in the history of Tibetan Buddhism, 800 years plus back, and then a fairly sort of standard progression or fairly straightforward timeline up down to the present. I did my best to make sure that we had a representative from all of the major Buddhist schools included, and we do. We have Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya, Geluk, and Bon all included. I also wanted to make sure that we had, it was not sort of too monolithic, and so we included Kedrupje, a Geluk figure, who's really the closest thing that we're going to get to someone advocating for consuming meat. So at least one of the texts in here, all of the texts I would say take nuanced presentations, but one of them at least comes down pretty hard on the side of eating meat is okay. And I wanted to make sure that we included that voice in here so that as people read it, as they get a sense for what Tibetan perspectives on vegetarianism are like, they're getting as complete a picture as we could present for them.
Fantastic. You involved the help of several translators for the book as well, and I'm curious about the collaborative process that you went through with getting this work translated. So who did you work with, and how was that process?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually a really interesting process. This was, I had two projects going kind of simultaneously. One was a journal issue that I edited on animals in Tibet that came out about a year ago. And this one, and the editorial process was actually really different. With the two of them, this project really, I have to really give a lot of credit to the other translators. It was a delight to work with them. And also this was, I feel like I should say that they didn't get paid for this, right? None of them received, the only compensation they get was a couple copies of the book. And so I really appreciate the time and the effort that they all took to make this happen. When I reached out to people, I tried to reach out to people who were already engaging with the work of these particular authors, right? And so people who were already deeply familiar with Dolpopa's work, right, with Michael Sheehy, or people who were deeply familiar with Ngorchen Kongpa Zangpo, in the case of Jörg Heimbel, Anna Johnson, again, on K-Drip J. All of the people who contributed to this are really, they're experts on these individual people. And it was really, I really can't say how much I appreciate their willingness to put in a lot of effort. I mean, this is, in some ways, translators' work is kind of a thankless task, right? We do the work and it comes out, but it has the original author's name on it. And I just want to really give all of these people credit for the hard work that they did. And honestly, for making my job so easy, right? These things could easily have devolved into conflict and hurt feelings and difficulties, but really everybody was just awesome to work with.
I love it when that happens, when the whole process is so seamless and everybody's so positive from beginning to end, and it just comes together. That's just rare, and we just have to love it when it happens.
Yeah, I really, like I said, I appreciate all of these people very much.
So before we talk about a few specific stories within the book, I am curious if you can just sort of summarize the Buddha's stance on vegetarianism, because we're going to dive into Tibetan Buddhism. So what is So we got to talk about the guy.
The guy himself. This is actually one of the hardest. This is a really hard question to answer. And the truth is, I don't think I can. I don't know that anybody can. Because part of it is because we have so many competing visions of what the Buddha said, right? So we have texts that, may or may not be actually datable to the Buddha himself, but are presented in the history, in the lineage, and according to, the Buddhist tradition as being authentic words, speech of the Buddha. And sometimes we have different perspectives here, and sometimes they are in conflict with each other. That said, there's been a couple of different articles written about, did the Buddha himself eat meat? And in all honesty, my guess is that yes, he probably did. There's a rule called threefold purity, which shows up. It's mentioned in all of the different versions of the Vinaya, the rules for monastics. And in that rule, the Buddha says that it's okay to eat meat as long as you haven't seen, heard, or suspected that the animal was killed specifically for you. The upshot of that is, as long as the animal was not killed for your sake, then according to this rule, it's okay to eat it. And that rule shows up in again, all of the different versions of the Vinaya we have in Chinese, in Pali, in Tibetan. And so I think that there's a good guess that that probably dates to at least a very early period of Buddhism. At the same time, we have other texts. We have particularly Mahayana texts like the Lankavatara Sutra and the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, where the Buddha, speaking as the Buddha, explicitly says that that rule of threefold purity is should no longer be followed, and that now the rule is everyone should be vegetarian. And so to understand what the Buddha himself said requires sorting through these texts and deciding which ones he actually said and what he didn't actually say. And that is a project that's beyond me.
Yeah, well, and we didn't have this fancy recording software 2,600
exactly.
years ago, so we can't really understand ever.
Well, exactly. Perhaps, although I got to say, I think that the early monks did a pretty amazing job of memorization.
That's awesome.
And I think they had these they didn't have like recorders, but they had memorization technology that's pretty impressive in and of itself.
Yeah, well, and their attention wasn't being drawn to the internet and things like that at every given second of every day. Okay, so let's talk about Tibet. How long have Tibetans in their society been debating the ethics or the faults of eating meat? How long has this been a conversation in their society?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a hard question to answer because of the question of relevant sources. The Tibetans, Buddhism was introduced to Tibet first really strongly in the 7th, 8th, 9th century. And it's unclear to me if vegetarianism was a practice at that point, if that was part of the discussion or not. It kind of seems like it might not have been, but I'm not certain. But definitely by the 11th century, the early 11th century, we have records of Indian Buddhist masters who have come to Tibet to teach. I'm specifically thinking about Atisha, who discuss vegetarianism, or at least discuss the question of meat eating. So at least by that point, it seems like this was a live issue that was not necessarily settled, but was at least something that was discussable and debatable and shows up by the late 11th, early 12th century. We have solid historical records of individuals who had become vegetarian. So clearly by that point, it was definitely a thing, right? This was not universal by any measure, but there are, enough records of individuals that I can feel pretty confident that by the early 12th century, vegetarianism was a thing.
Okay.
And was a real thing.
So now that we have the Buddha's position established, and we have sort of like a timeline for when the Tibetans became interested in the ethics of eating meat, something jumps out at me. Like when we think of 11th and 12th centuries, that does not strike me as an easy, particularly time to be alive. I feel like if I were living in the 11th or 12th century, that just surviving would sort of be my main priority, which is very, very unlike today, where I can go down the street to Burger King and get an Impossible Whopper and still be a vegetarian. How did Tibetans get into discussing this issue in a time period in history when people might think they would just be mostly focused on survival?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's also the how and such. I think the obvious answer is through Buddhism, right? The people that we have records of who were interested in vegetarianism are coming at it primarily from a Buddhist lens. And one of the things that Buddhism, particularly Mahayana Buddhism, really preaches is compassion. And it's, there's no question that animals are included within the scope of that compassion. And so, people are getting into Buddhism, they're getting excited, they're reading this stuff, some of them are becoming monks, nuns. And it's not difficult, I think, to then see how people might start to question practices like killing animals for food. That doesn't mean that it was easy for them, right? Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that's really striking about vegetarianism in the Tibetan context particularly in like the pre-modern medicine context, is the degree to which pretty much everybody understood it to be an ascetic practice. Like nobody thought it was good for you. Everybody thought that it was bad for your health. Everybody thought that a lot of people thought it would shorten your lifespan. A lot of people, thought it would, according to traditional Tibetan medicine, the idea, if you don't eat a lot of meat, they sometimes say that you'll end up with a wind disorder, and you'll end up you're physically weaker, thinner, and kind of almost a little jittery. And so people are becoming vegetarian not because it's easy, and not because they think it's healthy, but despite the fact that it's difficult, and despite the fact that they think it's not good for them. There's one really striking story about a very early master who was vegetarian, and he's lying there dying of old age, and the doctor says, "Well, you'll get better if you eat, or if you take a soup that contains dried yak lung as a medicine." And he says no and refuses, and he dies. And there's this real sense that being vegetarian was a difficult thing that people did. Yeah, not because it was like fun and happy, but because they felt like their sort of desire or need or compassion towards animals outweighed the discomfort and physical distress that this diet was going to cause them.
Wow, that is so different than today.
Yeah, it is. It's totally different than today, where I was just reading the other day an article that seemed to assume that everybody became vegetarian for health reasons. It was just sort of like, oh, interesting.
Okay,
Yeah.
So how were these debates across Tibetan history stratified? Like, were like certain like social classes, religious lines?
Yeah.
Like, who is for and who is against
Yeah.
vegetarianism in Tibetan society throughout the centuries?
Yeah. Okay. So it's the records that we have are almost always records of elite practitioners. So these are the lamas, right? The high ups. We have a lot fewer records of what like day-to-day run-of-the-mill monks might have thought, or even lay people. But there are definitely patterns across history. It seems clear to me, at least, that there was a really strong vegetarian movement, say from the 13th through the 15th century. And we have, lots of prominent vegetarians. We have some places like Ngor Monastery, Sakya Monastery, which may actually have legitimately instituted vegetarianism on a monastery-wide scale, so that all of the monks had to be vegetarian. Then in the 15th century, that starts to wane. And, it's a complicated question of why, but I think that definitely part of it is the rise of the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism, and particularly Khedrubje's writings on meat eating, which were more permissive than we had seen from a lot of previous authors. And his opinions, I think, kind of became the norm within the Gelug, which pretty quickly became one of the dominant schools of Tibetan Buddhism. And so I think with that, we start to get a place where sort of vegetarianism fades. And a couple centuries later, even at Ngor, which, like I just said, may once have been fully vegetarian, we get people criticizing the monks of Ngor for going out and slaughtering animals. So it never goes away, right? There are ongoing records of people being vegetarian after that, but it doesn't really pick up again, as far as I can tell, until the 19th century, where it really takes off in Eastern Tibet. And it seems like it's become such a thing there that by the early 20th century, it was almost kind of like it was a choice that people made. It wasn't normative, but it seems like it was actually really common, and it was a pretty normal choice for someone to make. People weren't going to flip out if you announced that you were vegetarian.
Did vegetarianism change at all based on who were prominent religious leaders at certain times or anything like that?
I think we have to assume so. The catch is we don't really have records. Like, mostly what we have records of is what the prominent religious people said. And, so we can I think we can assume that probably people listened to them. But it's hard to say, like, it's hard to ask or to answer a question like, did this person have more impact than that person? Because it's like, we don't have, it would be great to have like a record from monasteries where they were like, in 1512, we bought 30 yaks for food or something like that. But at least I'm not aware of those records. So it's really hard to get into the details of these kinds of questions.
Sure.
But I think that, the broad patterns at least are pretty clear.
Did you find any evidence of things like famines or shortages of anything that may have like driven people away from vegetarianism because like they just needed to survive?
Yeah, not so much.
Okay.
I think I have not seen a lot of that. The thing that I think makes a couple of things, and I actually explore this more in the earlier book in Food of Sinful Demons, but there are a couple of things that I think it definitely drove people away from vegetarianism. A big one being the health concerns that I mentioned earlier, and the sense that being vegetarian was distinctly unhealthy. But also just sort of the cultural place of meat in Tibetan culture beyond Buddhism, where meat really is a food, a cultural touchstone. And so giving it up then became, it was a difficult thing for people to do, or was perceived to be, I think, a really difficult thing for people to do. And so I think that there were some real headwinds that the vegetarian movement, or whatever, if we want to call it that, was running into. And honestly, I think there's some parallels between those headwinds that it faced in Tibet and the kind of situation that it finds itself in today, where a lot of people do assume that meat is necessary for health. And a lot of people in the US, assume that meat's necessary for health. And a lot of people also, it's very important on cultural levels for a whole variety of different communities across the US. And so I think that this is, to come back to an earlier point, I think this is part of why I wanted to make these texts available, is so that people can look at and dissect and parse where there's similarities, where there's differences, and maybe there's something in the Tibetan accounts of these of vegetarianism that is actually useful for contemporary people who are wrestling with this.
Who are some of the prominent historical figures in Tibetan Buddhism who wrote a lot about eating meat within a Tibetan context throughout the centuries? Like, who are some of your heavy hitter writers from throughout the years?
Yeah, there's a few who really stand out. The first sort of heavy hitter, as you say, would be Shabkar. He clearly wrote more about this than anybody else that I'm aware of. But also other really important figures include several different members of the Karmapa lineage. And the Karmapas are an incarnation lineage in the Kagyu school. And several of them were vegetarian. Several of them wrote about it. And they occupied such an important position within the religious hierarchy that, when they said stuff, people listened and continued to. And the 17th Karmapa has been a strong advocate for vegetarianism in the contemporary world.
So you just mentioned Shabkar as well.
Yeah.
And so he stood out to me in the book, and I'm glad you mentioned him. So he died in 1851, and you wrote in the book that he promoted vegetarianism relentlessly. So I'm just picturing this guy, like if he had the internet, like he would be out there like talking about vegetarianism on Facebook all the time. Were these people into these ideas?
He was clearly into this. Yes, this was not the only thing he wrote about. Right, and so it's his collected works. I'm looking at. I've got a set of them here in my office, and they run to 14 volumes. I believe is it 14 or 13? 14 volumes. And not all of that is about vegetarianism, but he wrote several major works on vegetarianism, and also clearly seems to have promoted it in sort of an ongoing fashion in his teachings. One of his last major works deals heavily with vegetarianism, among other topics. And it just is clearly something that he comes back to. He also, his autobiography, which is a wonderful read, translated by Mathieu Ricard, he gives us one of these sort of little bits of information that is actually really hard to come by, but it's a census of his students at the end of this text. And one of the things he says is that, like, of my 1,500 students, 300 made the decision to become vegetarian, which is actually a pretty striking thing, which means that in his sphere of influence, 300 of his followers, of his sort of like main followers, I guess we could say, had become vegetarian. And so that tells us that at least at that time and place, it was not just Shabkar, right, who would have been in a position to have, lots of food and whatever he wanted, really. As this elite lama, people would have been happy to give him whatever he asked for. But also more ordinary members of the religious community, people who clearly cared about Buddhism, but were not necessarily high-level lamas with access to fancy food and things like that. So at least in that instance, Shabkar tells us that, vegetarianism, again, it was a thing that was floating around.
Another teacher in the text that jumped out at me is the 18th century teacher, Jigme Lingpa. And he writes, and this is a direct quote in the book, he writes, "Having now become animals, your fathers, mothers, siblings, and friends from previous lives tremble with fear in the butcher's sinful hands, tears streaming from their eyes and panting for breath." So Jigme Lingpa called meat a sinful food. So considering the passage I just read and the use of the term sinful as a descriptor, can you tell me a little bit more about this passage of how people and loved ones become animals and why this is so important?
Yeah, definitely. Before I talk too much about it specifically, it's a little bit funny because those people who've seen me speak know that I include this passage in about every talk that I give. I just find it's just a really striking passage that in a lot of ways encapsulates the entirety of sort of a lot of the main themes of Tibetan attitudes towards animals and meat eating. So I love this passage. But when you ask, you start by asking about the sinful descriptor. And sinful is a loaded word. I use it here, knowing that and on purpose. The Tibetan word that's being translated as sinful is dikpe. And really what Jigme Lingpa is trying to say is that, this act, right, is a negative act. And what the butcher does is a negative thing, right? It's a bad action. And he's also clearly, and this is part of what makes it so interesting to me, he's clearly trying to produce an affective response in his audience, right? Like, if we look at a lot of the earlier texts on vegetarianism, they approach it from a almost kind of legalistic standpoint, right? And they argue about the intricacies of the rule of threefold purity. They argue about, like, does this rule, does the need for compassion outweigh threefold purity? But the whole tone of a lot of that writing is, really legalistic, right? They're trying to figure out, what does the Buddha say? And Jigme Lingpa just says, like, he just tells this story, and it's this visceral, affective story with the animal has tears streaming from its eyes, it's panting for breath. This is not a sort of a legalistic account. This is an attempt, as far as in my reading, this is an attempt to get people to feel for the animal and to respond based on that emotional, affective connection to the creature that's dying in front of them. And so it not only is a beautiful passage, it also, Jigme Lingpa's writings, I think, also really mark kind of a transitional phase in the writings about vegetarianism, going from this sort of legalistic to this more affective language. And then we see later writers come back to that over and over and over again. The second thing you asked about there was this whole idea of having now become animals to your fathers, mothers, siblings, and friends from previous lives. And this actually draws on something, a really key point for a lot of Buddhists in their relationship with animals, that this idea that because of reincarnation, because we have all been reborn an essentially infinite number of times, at some point in the distant past, we were all related to each other, right? So we were all each other's parents, we were all each other's brothers, friends, so on and so forth. And so that means that the animal that's in front of you that you're considering eating was at some point in the past your parent. And presumably when they were your parent, they were nice to you, right? They took care of you, they raised you. And so the suggestion is now you owe them some level of kindness because of, as sort of repayment of their kindness to you. And this is something that actually comes up throughout the literature on vegetarianism and animals, and the question of animals. It's so prominent. It shows up in a couple of titles in like a text that did not make it into this book by the Eighth Karmapa, which says the title of the text is "A Letter on the Unsuitability of Eating the Meat of Our Old Mothers." Right. So just in the title, there's this allusion to the idea that the animal you eat now used to be your mother.
Wow. Okay. There's a lot of passages that seem to include things like entrails and grease and cracked ribs. Like, did you read through a lot of extremely graphic writing in order to put this together?
I think I included most of the graphic stuff. Okay. But no, the grease and the cracked ribs, I think you're thinking about Patrul. And Patrul Rinpoche, again, he follows Jigme Lingpa in writing these sort of affective presentations of the impact of eating meat, and really just trying to not argue on sort of the fine points of doctrine, but to really just be like, look and feel what you're doing and what you're causing to happen, right? And then act accordingly.
Yeah. Well, and there's also the idea of not getting away scot-free after, ignoring the advice of eating meat forever. Yeah. Like, there's something that awaits you. So chapter 9, there's a dream sequence that is in your book about what awaits meat eaters in hell. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Absolutely. This is a text written by Nyala Pema Doodle, a 19th century master from Eastern Tibet. And what he presents his text, and this is what's really makes this particular text so interesting and so beautiful, is it's a dream sequence. And he says that he wakes up, or I don't know if dream is even the right word, almost kind of visionary experience, where he goes off and finds himself sort of as a tourist in hell. And he's looking at these people who are suffering these really profound punishments. And I'm sort of looking at the text right now, and so if you don't mind, I'll just read a passage.
Yeah, please.
So he's in the reviving hell, and one of its quarters, he says, was filled with men and women, naked and helpless, before each of whom stood throngs of evil-looking servants with heads like birds, wild and domesticated animals, and ferocious beasts. Many of the servants held sharp weapons in their hands with which to slice apart and devour the flesh of their victims. Time and again they cut, and time and again the flesh grew back. Victims did not expire until their karma was fully exhausted. Right? So he's having this vision of hell, and in it he sees these people being tortured by animal-headed demons, where their bodies are being sliced up and cut to bits. And he's sitting there thinking, okay, what did they have to do to end up in this kind of a horrible situation? And all of a sudden, Avalokiteshvara appears. And Avalokiteshvara is the bodhisattva of compassion. And we would say one of the principal deities in Tibetan Buddhism. And he explains to Nyala Pema Dodul that these people are there because they had eaten meat in their past lives. And the result of that, the karmic result, is that they are now being sliced up by these animal-headed demons. And from a karmic standpoint, this makes a lot of sense, because one of the sort of assertions that the law of karma makes is that like follows like. And so if you do a particular bad thing, like chop up lots of animals in this life, or be the cause of chopping up lots of animals by eating meat, then you're likely in your next life to be chopped up by animals. Right, the sense of kind of almost like turnabout is fair play, and so Nyala Pema Dodul presents this. He writes it up later, right? He writes up this experience and presents it to his followers as a real warning, right? The sense of like it's not just about doing what's best for the animals, but this is what's best for you too, right? If you don't do this, if you continue to follow these sort of commit these negative acts, you'll have a hard place. You'll be in a difficult place, and you'll have to answer for that. It's notable that at the end of this passage, Nyala Pema Dodul himself says, he says, okay, I'm going to take a vow. I was not, am not. Sorry. Okay, we're going to cut that out.
Okay, let me write that down. 58.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Missed the quote. Okay, so it's notable that at the end of this passage, right, at the end of this text, Nyala Pema Dodul himself says, I will not ever eat meat again. He says, henceforth, may the thought of eating meat never even cross my mind. Right? So he's presenting this as something that had a real impact on him, and I presumably hoping that his story of it will have an impact on his students.
Okay. There's also, another idea that I couldn't help but take a second and third and fourth and fifth look at, and that is the Tantra Samayas. And I've never really talked a ton about Tantra on this show before, and it's something that's kind of like a mystery area to me in my own studies, and I'm curious about it. So the Tantra Samayas require practitioners to consume meat in Tibetan Buddhism as part of a ritual feast offering, and the list of meats caught my eye. I'm also curious about... Yeah, and I'm also curious what the feasts are about, when Tibetans would be encouraged to eat these meats, and what's up with the list of meats.
Yep. Okay, so Tantra is obviously a somewhat controversial collection of practices, both outside of Buddhism, but also within Buddhism. But part of Tantra, and Tantra also has just a ton of different kinds of practices, a ton of different kinds of ideas, and people are encouraged to do different things. So, we're only talking about I want to make clear, we're only talking about a small piece of it here. But part of what is sometimes encouraged in tantric practice is to consciously reject cultural norms. And the goal then is that this is a practice done as part of a mental transformation to really, so that the practitioner comes to see that everything is fundamentally empty, right? And so this comes back to sort of foundational concepts in Buddhist philosophy of emptiness, of insubstantiality, and so on and so forth. And the implication is that okay, I'm going to start over again.
It's fine.
So let me pick up. Can you finish up the question and then I'll start again there?
How did I say it? Do you want me to talk about
You said, yeah, you wanted to talk about the tantric samayas, and I don't remember exactly what you said.
Okay, hold on a second.
But I'm feeling like I lost the thread there.
Oh, it's fine. So
something
that jumped out at me as well is the Tantra Samayas. And these are something that I have very little familiarity with in my own knowledge. And it caught my eye because of the list of meats that are used within a ritual feast offering. And so since we're talking about vegetarianism, it's interesting to talk about ways that meat is sometimes encouraged, and feast offerings may do that. Is there anything that you can tell us about, like, this very fascinating feast ritual and what the meats are and how often this would happen and things like that? Because it really caught my eye.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is definitely one of the most sort of interesting and really fascinating aspects of this whole discussion. Before talking specifically about the feast offerings, I feel like I should step back a little bit and talk about Tantra itself. Because Tantra is often, I think, misunderstood by contemporary audiences, and it's a really varied thing. So there are a lot of different types of tantric practice. There are a lot of different specific practices that are advocated. And so what we're talking about here is really only a piece of tantric practice. But one of the things that does show up in some forms of Tantra is the idea that practitioners should consciously reject the norms of society. And the justification for that lies in this idea that fundamentally everything is actually empty, and that the meaning that and the sort of the values that we have are actually socially constructed values. And so there's a sense within these tantric practices that sometimes going against those socially constructed values can actually be a really powerful way of training your mind to see the whole world as empty, and that to see the whole world as, in some ways, socially constructed. And so the idea here with the feast offering is that there's a particular Buddhist deity. A collection of people will get together to offer a feast to that deity, and it's usually framed as an offering. But then as part of the ritual, the practitioners will also consume some of the offering, and it's usually said that the 5 meats need to be included in that offering. And as you picked up, those are a pretty striking list of meats.
Yeah.
They vary sometimes, so you get slightly different lists, but it always includes human. It always includes dog, horse, elephant usually, and always includes cow. Okay, so it always includes beef. And the thing that all of these meats have in common is that in ancient India, where the tantras originated, they were deeply taboo, right? Like, you don't eat people, you don't eat dog, you don't eat, elephant, you don't eat cow, right? Because this is coming out of a culture in which cows were venerated. So you don't eat beef. And so when practitioners would consume even just a little bit of these substances, they're doing something that the culture says is not okay, right? And they're doing it on purpose in order to, essentially as a training, in order to demonstrate to themselves, and also I suppose to anybody watching, that they recognize that those taboos are cultural constructs rather than something intrinsic to the substance itself. So they're saying, look, this human flesh is no different than any other food, right? We think it's different, but that difference is only in our mind. And so by eating it, I'm saying, you know what? I'm transcending these cultural norms. I'm transcending this sort of mistaken perception of the world. And so in that context, it's said that doing practices like this can be a really powerful and very effective way of moving towards ultimately enlightenment. The catch, at least in the Tibetan context, is that sometimes this sort of permissibility, or the fact that people were encouraged to eat the 5 meats, was then taken by other people to be like, well, then I should just eat meat all the time, every day. And so one of the things that we see in a lot of these texts is a concern that eating the 5 meats not turn into just eating them for fun, right? And so you get people arguing really strongly that, look, yes, you have to have this, you have to eat these when you perform this ritual, but it's only these. It's not yak, it's not sheep, right? It's not the meat that was normal for a Tibetan to eat, and it's only done in the ritual, okay? Patrul Rinpoche has a short passage where he says, look, if you eat the 5 meats out in the village just because you like the taste, then you're actually violating the same tantric samayas, the same tantric vows that require you to eat them in sok, in the ritual feast in the first place. So there's a concern on the part of many of these authors that the specific permission or the specific requirement to eat meat within this tantric context not then be read as license to just eat it all the time.
I would definitely encourage anybody who found that fascinating to read the section of the book where that's in, because it really captured my eye. So thank you for that additional explanation. That was really cool.
Definitely.
Can you tell me a little bit about the Tibetan practice of vegetarianism today? Is this like a country where it's like huge percentages of the population practice this, or is this still kind of like a marginal practice like it is here?
It's somewhere in between. I would say it's less marginal than it is in the U.S. At this point. We have to recognize that there are different Tibetan communities today. There are Tibetans who live in Tibet. There are Tibetans who live in India, Nepal, in exile. Also within Tibet, there are different communities that have sometimes very different norms. Where I've done most of my field work is in eastern Tibet, a region known as Kham. And there, it's actually surprisingly common these days for people to be vegetarian. And I often tell the story that when I first went to Kham in 2007, I visited Dzogchen Monastery, and I stayed a little bit with the monks at the Sri Singha Monastic College, and they ate their food together communally they had these 3 big vats of soup that cooked lunch. 2 of them had meat and 1 of them was vegetarian. By the time I went back 5 years later in 2012, all of them were vegetarian, and meat was straight up banned from anywhere within the monastery precincts. And so the sort of the rise of the vegetarian movement in Tibet, in contemporary Tibet, the strength of it really is a fairly recent phenomenon. And one of the interesting things, or one of the things that to watch, is as this movement matures, as people, as the enthusiasm of this first wave of, yes, we're all going to be vegetarian, starts to fade, how much will the movement be? How much will the movement continue, right? What kind of legs will it have? And so each time I go back to the area, I'm always sort of looking to see if things are changing. And I definitely think at this point that, that sort of the first flush of excitement has worn off. But I'm also still seeing a lot of people who are vegetarian. And I'm seeing, when I see people like in a restaurant order vegetarian food, the other thing that I notice is that I don't tend to see people be surprised about it. So, one person goes into a restaurant, orders the veg noodles, and nobody bats an eye. It's just a normal piece of life, right? And so I haven't been able to do like statistical analysis for a variety of reasons, but the movement is widespread and it's becoming fairly normal. My sense is that in northeastern Tibet, in Amdo, it is not nearly as strong. That's mostly anecdotal, what I've heard from other people. But also then in Lhasa in central Tibet, when I was there a couple of years ago, I noticed a lot of vegetarian restaurants. And so, these are restaurants that don't just have a vegetarian option, but where the whole restaurant is veg. And so I think it varies a lot by region. And then the exile community is another question. But clearly this is something that is happening. It has legs. It's not just a flash in the pan that's going to disappear. And it'll be really interesting to see how it develops over the next couple of decades.
Awesome. So you mentioned that in this volume, The Faults of Meats from Wisdom, that you cut a lot of, pieces. Do you think you could ever see yourself doing a second volume of this?
Myself, probably not. There is a lot of work that goes into this. And I think, honestly, that we came up with a good cross-section of textual sources.
So what? So what is next for you?
I've got a couple of projects going on the animal side, on the vegetarian side. I'm trying to think about ways to introduce some of these ideas that we're seeing here more directly into the philosophical debates surrounding vegetarianism right now. So trying to move not just sort of within the world of Tibetan studies, not just within the world of people who are interested in Buddhism and animals, but also into the world of people who are interested in just animals, right? Or who are interested in animal ethics, vegetarianism, and trying to kind of get some of these ideas, which I think are interesting, but also really pertinent, and that I think give some new perspectives on some of the standard questions, right? The moral standing of animals, the question of should people be vegetarian or not. And I think that there are some new perspectives in here that could really impact these broader discussions. And so that's what I'm really working on at the moment. On that side, I've also have a whole new project going on that looks at the practice of guru devotion. And so that's a whole other thing. It's still very much in the early research stages, but that's also coming down the pipeline.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Geoff Barstow, author and editor of The Fault of Meats, Tibetan Buddhist Writings and Vegetarianism, out from Wisdom Publications. I'm super grateful to you for your hour today. I know you're super busy and have a million things going on. Can you guide listeners to where they may find you if they want to follow you and your work?
Yeah, sure. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. It's at The Lost Yak. That's also the URL for my homepage, my website. So people are welcome to come and connect with me there. I try to keep, particularly on Twitter, fairly active. So you definitely come hang out with me there.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Geoffrey Barstow, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas. It's been a real pleasure. And everybody check out the book.
All right, will do. Thank you very much.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.